Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight live from Warsaw. With the war going on in Europe, we face, and I know that everybody knows that now, we face the greatest security challenge since the end of the Second World War, hybrid warfare and violations of NATO's airspace. So we have to be able to defend ourselves, said Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, as European leaders gathered in for a high-level summit in Copenhagen on Wednesday. More on that in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant faces critical situation after week-long outage. European countries vow to shoot down all aircraft violating their airspace. And Poland to extend temporary border controls with Germany and Lithuania. European defense-dominated talks at the Copenhagen Competitiveness Summit on Wednesday, with topics spanning the development of a drone wall and unmanned aircraft wreaking chaos across the continent. Moreover, a pitch spearheaded by European Council President Antonio Costa about Ukrainian accession to the EU was laid bare. We're joined now by our EU correspondent Angela Skujins from the Danish capital. Good evening, Angela. So what more can you tell us about these talks?
Good evening, Claudia. So what we're hearing from our sources here in the Danish capital, that European defence dominated this informal European Council summit here in the Danish capital, spanning 4 hours, eating into the time dedicated for Ukraine. What we're hearing from our diplomats that spoke to TVP World on condition of anonymity is the reason that this took up so much time on the agenda is due to the spate of recent drone incursions occurring over Europe's skies. At least half a dozen countries in the European Union have faced incidents such as this. We're talking about Romania, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and recently Denmark, really highlighting and underscoring the need for bolstering Europe's security and defence architecture, with that recent drone incursion occurring here in Copenhagen, shutting down the airport and sending the city into a tailspin. We heard from the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen on the doorstep of this meeting in the Danish capital this morning. She described this spate of hybrid warfare incidents and violations of NATO's airspace as the greatest security challenge facing Europe since the end of the Second World War.
I hope that everybody recognizes now that there is a hybrid war, and one day it's Poland, the other day it's Denmark, and next week it will probably somewhere else that we see sabotage, or we see drones flying, or we see you can there are many different kind of episodes. So I see this from a European perspective. There is only one country that are willing to threat us, and it is Russia, and therefore we need a very strong answer back.
Speaking of strong answers back, European Council President Antonio Costa used the 1 hour dedicated to the topic of Ukraine to gauge the temperature in the room for a change of the treaty. This would allow Ukraine to move forward with its accession bid without countries such as Hungary blocking their way. This is colloquially called the Costa proposal. But what we're hearing from diplomats here is that it has more or less gone down like a lead balloon, with some member states worried that this could set a precedent, allowing EU aspirant countries to join the bloc without the proper vetting and approval of the 27. We heard from Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban earlier this morning, vociferously blocking Ukraine's bid to join the EU. However, the Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico wasn't in attendance today, so we didn't hear commentary from him. However, TVP World did speak to the Slovak National Security Advisor Morislav Lajčák at the Warsaw Security Forum, where he clarified Bratislava's position on the war-torn country potentially joining the European Union.
Ukraine is our neighbor, and when my Prime Minister met with President Zelensky 3 weeks ago, he said very clearly that Slovakia wishes Ukraine to achieve a just peace and to be able to focus fully on its economic development and European integration.
Speaking of integration, we know that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is well on his way to the Danish capital, where he says that he wants to share intelligence and knowledge, particularly with Denmark, regarding how to fight these hybrid warfare incursions. We know that his country has battled unmanned aerial weapons such as this historically, previously to this day. He wants to share this information with his Danish partners and his European allies so they can better combat Moscow's military might, whether that is on land, at sea or in the sky. These conversations will continue well into tomorrow with the European Political Community Summit, where we'll be covering all of that for you. But that's all from Copenhagen. I'll send it to you in Warsaw.
Angela Skujins live from Copenhagen. And now let's go live to Ukraine, where our correspondent Alex Kadier is standing by in Kyiv for us. Good evening, Alex. So how will Ukrainians be reacting to this new momentum among EU leaders?
Well, good evening, Claudia. With impatience and some degree of frustration, it has to be said. We've been reporting in the last day or so of fresh strikes in Kharkiv, in Sumy, where an entire family was killed. So discussions long into the night, discussions about opening accession chapters, discussions about a drone war will be a sense of impatient frustration for so many Ukrainians who have been fighting this war and this Russian threat for 3.5 years. What they see as a threat to the entirety of Europe without much of a European reaction to that direct threat. Nevertheless, we heard from President Zelensky, as my colleague Angela Skujins just mentioned in Copenhagen. He is on his way there, and he was focusing on that European unity, making it clear that nobody has more experience in fighting Russian drone warfare or fighting against Russian drone warfare than the Ukrainians themselves. A very good example of that is that Ukrainian advisors are in Copenhagen to help with the security of that summit. We heard from President Zelensky urging his European partners to move quickly on the 19th package of sanctions, urging his European partners to stop finally buying Russian oil and gas. He wants to see more. He also emphasized the fact that his country is continuing with reforms to join the European Union despite being in the middle of this full-scale invasion from Russia. So clearly some impatience from the Ukrainian side, but President Zelensky choosing to highlight what Ukraine can bring to the table. Of course, that is better air defense, better technology for Ukraine and for the rest of Europe as well, Claudia.
So far from Copenhagen, the situation on the ground at Europe's nuclear power station remains precarious. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you're right to make that comparison, Claudia. It's quite a stark contrast. It always feels that way when you're reporting in Ukraine and listening to what's happening in Brussels and Copenhagen and elsewhere. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station for more than a week now has been running on diesel generators to power the pumps that cool down the station's 6 reactors. That was the urgent message, the critical message by President Zelensky, warning that this could be a problem. Let's have a listen.
For the 7th day now, and by the way, there has never been such a thing before. There has been an emergency at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The situation is critical. Due to Russian shelling, the plant has been disconnected from the power grid. It is supplied with electricity from diesel generators. This is extraordinary. The generators and the plant are not designed for this. They have never worked in this mode for so long, and we already have information that one of the generators has failed. It is the Russians who are preventing the repair of the power grid lines to the plant and the restoration of basic security through shelling. And this is a threat to absolutely everyone. No other terrorist in the world has ever allowed himself to do to a nuclear power plant what Russia is doing now.
Stark warning from President Zelensky, who blamed Russia for cutting off those power lines. Russia naturally blames Ukraine shelling for those power lines being cut. But nevertheless, Claudia, you do have to pause and think. The largest nuclear power station, 500 kilometers away from Chernobyl, is running on diesel generators. A source of concern for the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, warning that any fighting around these nuclear power plants could lead to a serious nuclear accident. For now, they say radiation levels are stable and that the situation on the ground at the station is normal, but they want to see power restored as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. That was Alex Kadier reporting live from Kyiv. Let's move on. Reckless Russian provocations testing NATO's response will not go without consequences. The Netherlands will shoot down Russian planes if they pose a direct threat to any objects on its territory, including drones and missiles mirroring Poland and Germany. The Dutch defense minister issued this stark warning in exclusive comments for TVP World at the Warsaw Security Forum. Kazimierz Łysiak has more on Russia testing Europe's patience in a new era of hybrid war.
The Netherlands won't rule out shooting down Russian jets over its territory if push comes to shove.
If there's a direct threat, if you see that a plane, for example, is going towards a target or is about to attack a target, or when it's attacking a Dutch or a Western plane, then you have the right to self-defense, and then you do that.
In exclusive comments for TVP World at the Warsaw Security Forum, the Dutch defense minister said drones and missiles are fair game as well.
If there's a direct threat, you should be able to take it out. For example, the drones, our F-35s took them out. And I think when it comes to missiles, it's clear. You need to, of course, intercept them.
Dutch planes indeed helped Polish jets shoot down several drones over Poland in early September, in the first ever case of NATO forces engaging Russian assets. Suspicious drones then appeared in at least 10 European countries in the span of 4 weeks. Their governments and militaries are now faced with a difficult question: how to respond.
But they are testing the system. They are watching our responses. They are testing, what are our radar capabilities.
But shooting down drones with missiles is not an obvious choice. Not only is it extremely cost inefficient, there is also the problem of falling debris. This house in Poland being a perfect example, as pieces of a missile which struck a Russian drone tore off the entire upper floor, narrowly missing the building's elderly residents. That's why NATO is now preparing to fight fire with fire.
I actually believe we're going to see a lot of work on counter-drone, anti-drone technologies, because we can't afford to keep shooting very, let me say it one more time, very expensive defensive missiles at cheap drones.
There is also the question of where these drones are coming from. In the case of Poland, it was clear. Most of them flew in from Belarus, Russia's de facto puppet state. But when it comes to other European countries, they could be coming from Russia's tried and tested tool for hybrid war, the Shadow Fleet.
And there is growing evidence that Russia may have used tankers in the Baltic Sea to launch drones. The drones that caused major disruption in Northern Europe.
The European Union has already sanctioned close to 600 Russian decommissioned tankers. Apart from being suspected of cutting underwater cables in the Baltic Sea, they're mostly used to sell sanctioned Russian products on the side.
The Shadow Fleet is a threat that you can use the Shadow Fleet not only carrying the oil, but you can also put different containers onto that ship, and you can use the containers for launching the drone swarms.
Danish and Norwegian investigators are now looking into that possibility.
For us, it's also important to have low tension, but also to be aware and prepared. We are preparing for war, to avoid war, so deterrence is a huge part of what we're doing up in the north.
But wherever Russia is launching these drones from, it's clear that Europe has some catching up to do in this latest arms race, especially since Moscow is not afraid to skew the rules for a minimal cost.
It's what I often call the AC/DC approach to sabotage. Putin's dirty deeds done dirt cheap. He's been basically having the GRU contact folks that are of non-Russian origin and paying them a little amount of money to a little amount of sabotage.
For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
Polish authorities have decided to extend temporary border controls with Germany and Lithuania for another 6 months. The regulation has already been signed by Polish Internal Affairs Minister Marcin Kierwiński and will take effect on Sunday. The latest extension means controls on Poland's border with Lithuania and Germany will remain in place until April 4th, 2026. According to Kierwiński, the goal is to monitor the migration route that leads from the Baltic states through Poland into Western Europe. Border controls were reinstated on July 7th and have since then been extended several times, most recently from August 6th to October the 4th. Meanwhile, the situation in Georgia, a former EU accession hopeful, is becoming more dire. As local elections approach, former President Salome Zurabishvili has called on the opposition and the civil society not to participate. Instead, massive protests are expected to sweep through the country, potentially escalating tensions between the pro-Russian government and Georgian people as authorities are systemically conducting a crackdown on the opposition. Randy Potts has this next report.
As local elections are set to be held in Georgia on Saturday, the country's former president and top opposition figure Salome Zurabishvili is calling for their boycott.
Nobody practically is participating, and those that are participating are doing so under pressure of the authorities. Two of the leaders of the parties that is participating have been in jail, and they have been released essentially in order to participate. So nothing to expect, but much to expect from the protest on the streets.
And while some opposition parties will participate in the vote, a majority is expected to abstain and join the expected protests. The planned October 4th elections will lack credible international and local observers, as election monitors from OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, say they will not be able to deploy a mission.
Transparent and credible election observation requires thorough preparation and the ability to access key stages of the election process, in line with our comprehensive methodology. Regrettably, the Georgian authorities' decision to invite us at such a late stage prevents meaningful observation.
Election observers have been crucial in the region, as both Moldova and Armenia have faced Russian interference in local politics. Moldova's pro-EU PAS party recently won a thin majority in parliament. Armenia's next elections are scheduled early next year. Georgia has been in a prolonged political crisis ever since last year's parliamentary elections, which both opposition groups and international observers say were rigged. After the controversial elections, ruling party Georgian Dream suspended Tbilisi's bid for EU membership and began a 10-month crackdown on independent media and civil society, which quickly expanded to include arrests of many popular opposition leaders. Just this week, Jela Kashaya, an activist and member of the opposition Girchi, More Freedom Party, was arrested late at night on Monday. For TVP World, Randy Potts.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once one of Russia's most powerful men, later became Putin's biggest and longest-standing enemy. The oligarch-turned dissident made an appearance at the Warsaw Security Forum and spoke to TVP World's Diana Skaya about why the West failed to stop the war in Ukraine, how Putin maintains power despite setbacks, and what must happen for real change in Russia. Please enjoy.
Hello and welcome to TVP World. My name is Diana Skaya and we're here at the Warsaw Security Forum. And my guest here is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of Vladimir Putin's most outspoken critics, a leading figure in the Russian opposition and co-founder of Russian Anti-War Committee. Mikhail,
I'm very glad that you're with us today at the Security Forum office. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Let me ask you this. You've been in emigration for over 10 years. Am I right in thinking that you still manage to influence things inside Russia?
Судя по тому, что мои выступления смотрят сотни тысяч.
Well, judging by the fact that my speeches are watched by hundreds of thousands, sometimes even 1 million people, most of whom live in Russia, it seems that what I say is still of interest to that part of Russian society.
For example?
I
often speak on topics related to the Russian economy, war and peace, especially today's war, Russia's relations with other countries and political events happening inside Russia. I'd say that most of these topics, not all but most, are of interest to my fellow citizens.
больше меня знает и больше
Again, yes,
ко мне
probably more people from the
прислушивается,
older generation, those
старшее
aged
поколение,
50 and above,
то есть те,
know me and
кому
listen to me.
50.
But these people still make up the majority of Putin's
Но
electorate in
по-прежнему
Russia.
эти люди в России составляют большинство путинского электората.
And do they believe you? For example, if we take the war in Ukraine, what do they believe?
К сожалению, за более чем уже 3,5 года войны
Unfortunately, after more than 3.5 years of war, the situation in Russian society has changed dramatically. Yesterday I spoke at a plenary session here, and I was told that at the beginning of the war, 2/3 of the population supported it, and now polls show that 2/3 still support it. I say yes and no, because at the beginning of the war, those numbers were false. That support didn't really exist, but now it's more likely true because people have lost the sense of cause and effect. They've forgotten how the war started. In their minds, the war has always been there, and since it's been there, people say they want it to end through. The war has already been there, so people respond by saying, we would like it to end through negotiations, but we would also like to win. And the memory that it was Putin who started this war, started it out of nowhere, began killing people, began killing our neighbors and even direct relatives, has faded. Because in Russia, as you know, many families have relatives in Ukraine. This understanding has gradually disappeared from people's minds under the influence of propaganda. And this is the problem with long wars. People begin to feel like they're living in a different paradigm. For them, war becomes something normal. Although what kind of normal is that, for heaven's sake?
В другой парадигме, то есть для них война как бы это уже что-то нормальное, хотя какое-то к черту нормальное.
Mikhail, what does the picture of Russia after Putin look like? Is that even a possibility? And what do you think? How can any changes be brought about in Russia?
Какие-то перемены в России?
Well, first of all, of course, there will be a Russia after Putin. Only Putin thinks that there won't be a Russia after him. If back in 2022 the West had made the decision that Putin must lose the war and had provided Ukraine with the necessary support, then Ukraine most likely could have, as part of the Kharkiv operation, pushed Putin's troops out of its territory.
Выбить путинские войска со своей территории.
Do you think the West didn't help Ukraine enough?
Запад недостаточно помог Украине.
Back then, the West didn't help Ukraine enough because it believed that if Putin started losing, he would use nuclear weapons. The West believed that if Putin started losing, he would lose power. That was wrong. The second part was true. And the West believed that if Putin lost power, Russia would collapse. And the collapse of a country with nuclear weapons is what the West feared, although in reality, Russia wouldn't have collapsed if Putin's regime fell. Nevertheless, the West made the decision, and as a result, Putin is not losing the war now. And since he's not losing the war, his power has correspondingly increased. It's possible we'll see Putin in office for another 5 to 7 years.
And after him?
После него у России есть вполне себе понятная традиция.
After him, Russia has a fairly well-established tradition. When an autocrat leaves, someone from his inner circle is usually chosen to replace him. I mean, the inner circle makes the choice. And that person will be the one considered the weakest by the inner circle. So the weakest person will come after Putin. What will happen to Russia after Putin will of course depend largely on us, Russians, but to some extent it will also depend on the West. And now the West faces a practical decision. What does it want after Putin? Does it want an Iron Curtain with Russia gradually becoming a province of China? Or a vassal of China, which is where things are currently heading? Or does the West want Russia to be reintegrated into the Western world? No, full integration of Russia probably won't be possible in the near future.
Либо Запад хочет реинтеграции России в западный мир. Да, не полной интеграции России, вероятно, в ближайшем будущем не сможет быть частью, по-настоящему частью современной Европы, но она вполне может быть Russia
likely won't become a true part of modern Europe anytime soon. But it could become a country that is a sister civilization to Europe, something in between Europe and Asia, something that might resemble Russia more than, say, Turkey does.
Чем-то, что может быть в большей степени похоже на Европу, чем Турция, например. Это вопрос. И ответ на этот вопрос сегодня Европа дает себе. Первый ответ.
That's the question, and the answer to that question is being shaped today. Europe is currently giving itself the first answer, the Iron Curtain. In that case, all Russians are guilty. There should be no Russian students, no academic exchange, no cultural exchange. The second answer is more difficult and unpleasant for us Europeans. We distinguish between criminals and hostages. Even if the hostages suffer from Stockholm Syndrome, even if they justify the criminals, even if they look like criminals, we understand they are hostages. And then we continue to interact with them in some way. How? We continue to educate their children here and try not to sever the last threads of connection between Russia and Europe. And that choice is up to Europe.
Не порвать вот эти вот последние ниточки связи между Россией и Европой. И это выбор за Европой.
You just said not to sever the line between Russia and Europe. Let's go back. On September 10th, Poland, with NATO's help, shot down 19 Russian drones over Polish airspace. Do you think that was a mistake or a deliberate Russian provocation? What do you think overall? Poland and NATO responded quickly.
Я абсолютно убежден, что это была осмысленная провокация. Даже я бы сказал бы не провокация.
I'm absolutely convinced that this was a deliberate provocation, or rather, I'd say it wasn't even a provocation in the usual sense. It was a tool of hybrid warfare, psychological warfare. Because Anchorage, Alaska, showed that Europe strongly supports Ukraine, politically supports it, and Ukraine relies heavily on Europe.
Putin, конечно, решил, что надо, чтобы Европа эту поддержку Украине перестала оказывать. А как это сделать?
And of course, Putin decided that Europe should stop giving that support to Ukraine. How can that be achieved? By exerting psychological pressure on the European population so that European society puts pressure on its politicians, or maybe even replaces them with ones more favorable to Putin. Politicians who have a better attitude toward Putin than those currently in power. And how can that be done? By installing fear, by showing that you are defenseless, by showing that NATO won't protect you. And I wouldn't say Putin is entirely unconceiving in this regard. Just look at Poland's reaction. Poland shot down only 20% of the drones. 20%. The rest crashed on their own.
20%, остальные упали сами.
So what should NATO have done? Should it have bombed Russia or what? How do you see it?
Украина, воюющая Украина.
Ukraine, a country at war under immense pressure for several years, has shown that it can easily shoot down 80 to 90% of the drones that enter its territory. It's clear how to do it. It's clear what technical means are needed. So why was Poland, which borders warring countries, unprepared for attacks from Belarusian territory? Why? How can this be explained?
Answer the question.
Listen, it's hard for me to say. Sending fighter jets into the air against drones is a ridiculous situation. Using anti-aircraft missiles to hit them, also ridiculous. Because the cost for both sides are simply incomparable. Not having any anti-aircraft machine guns on the border, not having early warning systems. Guys, what are you doing? You're provoking Putin to believe that Europe is completely defenseless.
What advice would you give to governments or NATO, for example?
Я бы сказал, что, во-первых, ситуация, которая сложилась сегодня,
What I would say is, first of all, the current situation, where the military industry of all of Europe, of the European Union, is weaker than Russia's military industry in terms of production volume.
And
the situation where Europe's armies are in fact very weak, let's put it politely, very weak.
Очень слабы. Давайте так скажем вежливо, очень слабы. Если бы я был невежлив, я бы сказал бы...
If I were being impolite, I'd say they don't exist. And in a situation where America is stepping back, this situation threatens European countries with the loss of their sovereignty in relation to Putin's Russia.
Европейскими странами своего суверенитета по отношению к путинской России.
Вы знаете, с нами разговаривали вчера вот с коллегами, да, был...
You know, we spoke yesterday with colleagues, I can't recall exactly who, but we spoke with someone, a minister from the Nordic countries, I think. And according to him, NATO reacted very quickly and correctly. That was the right response. And it was precise and correct?
Слушайте, давайте, вот мы с вами обычные люди, да?
Listen, let's be honest. We're just ordinary people, right? There were 20 drones launched. The cost of one drone, well, definitely less than $10,000, right? For that type of drone. So in total, Russia spent a maximum of $200,000 on this.
В ответ было ударено зенитными ракетами общей стоимостью $1 миллион с лишним долларов.
In response, anti-aircraft missiles worth over $1 million were used, 6 times more expensive. And fighter jets were scrambled, each hour of which costs around $60,000. And they can't even shoot down drones because the drone's speed is too low compared to the jets. Why were they scrambled? No one understands. If that's the correct reaction, then please explain to me what an incorrect reaction would be.
Зачем их поднимали в воздух, никто не понимает. Если это правильная реакция, то объясните мне, что есть реакция неправильная.
Thank you very much, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for being here with us.
And that's all for us here on TVP World at the Warsaw Security Forum. I'm Diana Skaya, and my guest was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, from the co-founder of the Russian Anti-War Committee, in our exclusive interview. Thanks for watching.